had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The plan was simple. Get away from the city noise, the buzzing of screens and endless emails, and disappear into the woods for a few days. I found a small cabin deep in the mountains, far enough from any town or highway to guarantee silence, isolation, and a chance to clear my head. The kind of place where cell phones lose signal, where the only sound is the wind moving through the trees and the crackle of a fire at night. The cabin was off the beaten path, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through thick pine forests. The GPS barely worked once I turned off the main highway, but I'd printed a map and notes from the owner. The whole area looked untouched on satellite images. No neighbors, no cell phone towers nearby, just wilderness. I arrived just before sunset. The sky was a bruised mix of purple and orange, the kind of twilight that seems to hold its breath before darkness takes over completely. The air was cool but dry, with a faint scent of pine and earth. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood and took a moment to look around. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet. A simple wooden structure with a front porch, some rocking chairs pushed to one side. The wood was weathered but solid. The windows were clear and clean, reflecting the dying light. There was a stone chimney on one side. The whole place looked sturdy, well-maintained, but isolated. Felt good. I pulled my backpack out and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of old wood and a hint of something musty, like the cabin hadn't been used in a while. The floor creaked softly underfoot, and the walls were lined with shelves holding an assortment of books, old kitchen tools, and a few boxes of canned goods. A small table sat in the corner along with 2 chairs. A stove stood next to the chimney, with some firewood stacked nearby. I dropped my bags and started unpacking. No internet, no distractions. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. I went outside to gather some firewood before night fell completely. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, the trees tall and close together. The ground was covered with thick layers of pine needles and fallen leaves, soft underfoot. As I moved deeper into the trees, the sounds of the outside world faded away completely. The wind whispered through the branches. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. I found a good pile of dry wood, some fallen branches and dead trees that would burn well. I carried them back to the cabin and stacked them neatly near the stove. As darkness settled, I built a fire inside and watched the flames grow, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth of the fire was comforting, a sharp contrast to the cold night air pressing against the windows. That first night, I slept fitfully. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, kept me alert. I'd spent so much of my life in cities that this kind of silence was strange and almost unsettling. The darkness outside the cabin felt like a thick wall, pressing in. Morning came with soft gray light filtering through the trees. I made coffee on the stove, the aroma filling the small cabin. The air was crisp, cold enough to make me appreciate the fire still burning in the hearth. I ate a simple breakfast and planned to explore the area. The woods stretched in all directions, wild and quiet. I walked along a narrow trail that led downhill, past thick ferns and moss-covered rocks. The ground was soft beneath my boots, damp from an early morning mist. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, probably maybe a coyote judging by the size. After a couple of hours, I found a small creek cutting through the forest. The water was clear and cold, flowing over smooth stones. I took off my boots and dipped my feet in, the chill a sharp contrast to the warmth of the day. I sat on a rock nearby and just breathed in the stillness. Returning to the cabin, I gathered some firewood again and started prepping dinner. I cooked simple things, canned beans, rice, a little dried sausage. The smoke from the fire curled lazily up the chimney. As evening approached, the sky turned an intense shade of red and then purple, like the night was swallowing the day whole. That second night was harder to sleep through. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. There was a sound outside the cabin, a soft but deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I froze and listened, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The wind had died down, and the night was still except for those footsteps. They didn't move like a deer or any normal animal I knew. Too heavy, too steady, like someone walking carefully but with purpose. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand, switched it on, and aimed it out the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, catching nothing but shadows and trees. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I could feel a pressure, a weight in the air. It was a raw kind of fear, the kind that's not based on any explanation but on instinct. The next morning, I went outside to look around. I found footprints, large, heavy boots, in the soft dirt near the cabin. They were fresh, maybe from the night before. The prints led away from the cabin toward the deeper woods, but I didn't follow them. Instead, I studied them carefully. They were human, not animal. I felt exposed, alone. The cabin was supposed to be my refuge, but now I knew someone had been close. Too close for comfort. I spent the day on edge, checking all the locks on the doors and windows. The cabin was sturdy, but not built to keep someone out if they wanted in badly enough. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and my phone had no signal. As the sun set again, I prepared for a long night. I stacked extra wood next to the door and kept the fire burning brightly inside. I sat near the window, flashlight in hand, watching the woods for any sign of movement. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the cabin slowly, crunching through the leaves, stopping here and there. I didn't dare go outside or make a sound. I just watched, heart pounding. After what felt like hours, the footsteps stopped. I waited until dawn before I finally relaxed. That morning, I found something new. Scratches. Deep, jagged marks on the wood siding near the back door. Someone had tried to pry it open. The wood was splintered and gouged. I realized I couldn't stay there alone anymore. This was no longer a peaceful weekend getaway. Someone was watching me, maybe even trying to get inside. I packed quickly, not wanting to linger. But as I loaded my gear into the car, I caught a glimpse of a figure at the edge of the clearing, tall, silent, watching. The figure melted into the trees before I could react. I started the car and drove as fast as the dirt road allowed, never looking back. Once I reached the main highway, I stopped at a gas station and called the local sheriff's office to report what had happened. They said that the area had recently seen a rise in break-ins and that some people used the remote cabins for illegal activities. The sheriff advised me not to return. I never went back to that cabin or that part of the woods again. I remember the cabin like it was yesterday. It was deep in the woods, somewhere in northern Idaho, not far from the border but far enough from any town to feel completely cut off. I'd found it online, some listing for a remote rental, and I thought it would be the perfect escape from everything. From the city noise, the constant buzzing of my phone, the never-ending emails, the stress that never seemed to leave me. I'd been working for months without a break and needed some time alone. No distractions, no people, just the trees, the cold air, and silence. The directions were vague. The host sent me a GPS coordinate and a few notes. Follow the gravel road until it ends. Then look for the trail marker with the blue ribbon tied around the tree. The cabin is down the path about a quarter mile from there. I packed my car the night before, filled it with supplies, canned food, water, a gas stove, some firewood, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, and my phone charger, even though I didn't expect to get any signal. The drive was long, twisting through mountain passes and thick forests. As the road turned from paved to gravel, the trees grew taller, the air cooler. I kept watching the gas gauge nervously, because I knew there wasn't going to be a station for a long time. Eventually, the gravel road ended in a small clearing with a worn trailhead marked by a tree with a faded blue ribbon. I grabbed my backpack and started down the trail, which was overgrown in parts but still visible. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the distant call of birds. After about 20 minutes, I caught sight of the cabin. It was a small, rough-hewn wooden building with dark brown walls and a rusty metal roof. It looked old but sturdy, with a single window facing the trail and a wooden door secured by a heavy latch. A stone chimney rose from one side, stained black near the top. There was no porch, just a few steps leading up to the door. Nearby, a fire pit was ringed with stones, surrounded by scattered logs for seating. I unlocked the door with the key taped under a loose board by the entrance, just like the host had described. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A wood stove sat in the corner with a stack of firewood beside it. A small table and 2 chairs stood near the window, and a cot was pushed against the opposite wall. The floor was rough planks, and the walls were lined with old photographs and hunting trophies. A few deer heads, some antlers, and a faded black and white photo of a man standing next to a cabin that looked just like this one. I dropped my bag and started a fire in the stove. The wood was dry, so it caught quickly and warmed the room in minutes. I boiled some water for coffee, ate a simple meal of canned chili, and settled in to rest. The quiet was both peaceful and strange. There was no signal on my phone, no electricity, no running water. The only sound was the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the whisper of wind through the trees. That night, I slept poorly. I kept waking up to strange noises, cracking branches, distant rustling. But when I looked outside, there was nothing but darkness and the faint outlines of trees. I told myself it was just the wildlife. After all, I was in the middle of the forest. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. A small stream ran nearby, clear and cold. The trees were tall and close, the forest thick. I found an old trail marker that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. Part of me wanted to follow it, but I felt uneasy. Something about the place was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As the day wore on, I noticed subtle signs that someone else had been here recently. A few broken branches snapped underfoot, a patch of trampled grass near the fire pit, a cigarette but crushed into the dirt. I hadn't expected anyone else to be this far out, but maybe hunters or other campers passed through. I brushed it off and went back to the cabin to prepare dinner. As I gathered firewood, I noticed the sky growing darker earlier than usual. The weather was shifting quickly, clouds rolling in, thick and heavy. That evening, as I sat by the fire with my headlamp on, I heard a faint noise outside. At first, it was barely more than a whisper, but then it grew louder. A soft crunching on dry leaves, slow and deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. My heart rate jumped, and I stood up quickly, peering out into the blackness beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything, just shadows moving between the trees. I called out, but no answer. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed a flashlight and scanned the area, but nothing appeared. The wind shifted, and the forest was silent again. I locked the door and double-checked the windows before sitting back down. The feeling of being watched was intense now. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified. Branches breaking, something scraping along the side of the cabin, the low growl of an animal. I kept my knife close and the fire burning bright. The next morning, I found more evidence that someone had been near the cabin overnight. My firewood pile was disturbed. A few logs knocked over, footprints in the soft dirt around the fire pit. But there was no clear sign of who or what had been there. The prints were too large for a deer, too irregular for a dog or coyote. They were human. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. This was no longer just a quiet getaway. Someone else was out here, someone watching me. I decided to leave the cabin that day. I packed quickly, gathering my gear and stacking what firewood I could carry. I didn't want to stay another night with the possibility that whoever had been lurking outside might come back. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something new. A crude carving etched into the wooden door. It looked like a circle with several lines radiating outward, almost like a sun but jagged and rough, scratched deep into the wood. I'd never seen anything like it. It was not there the day before. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe it was a prank left by other campers or hunters, but the feeling of unease was overwhelming. I locked the cabin door behind me and started down the trail toward my car. The forest was quiet, the only sound my boots on the dirt path. The sky was overcast now, the wind cold and sharp. About halfway down, I heard it again. Footsteps behind me, slow and steady, matching my pace. I didn't turn around. Instead, I quickened my step, breaking into a jog. The footsteps increased too, faster, closer. I ran. Branches whipped my face, roots caught my feet, but I didn't stop. After what felt like forever, I broke through the trees and saw the clearing where I'd parked. My car was there, but I froze. The passenger door was open. A rush of panic hit me. I scanned the area quickly. No sign of anyone in sight. I sprinted to the car, jumped in, and slammed the door shut. My hands shook as I locked it. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the clearing onto the gravel road. I glanced in the rearview mirror but saw only trees rushing by. The rest of the drive was tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see headlights or a figure on the road. But nothing came. When I finally reached a gas station and a town with real people, I called the police to report what happened. The officers took my statement seriously, but said it was hard to investigate without more information. There had been reports of trespassers and illegal hunters in the area, but no confirmed crimes near the cabin recently. I went back home that day, exhausted and shaken. I didn't sleep well for weeks after. Looking back, I realized the thing that scared me most wasn't the wilderness or the isolation. It was the fact that someone else had been there, so close, watching and waiting with unknown intentions. No ghost stories or fairy tale monsters, just a person, lurking in the dark. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told many people about it. But sometimes, when I'm alone and quiet, I can still feel the weight of those footsteps behind me, the eyes in the shadows, and the rough carving on that door. It was real, and it was terrifying. I never imagined a cabin trip could turn into something so wrong. I didn't even plan for it to be scary. I just wanted to get away. Just me, some quiet, fresh air, a little time off the grid. I had no idea how bad it would get. The cabin was out in the middle of nowhere, at least it felt that way. I picked it online, a little rustic place in the woods of northern Vermont. Nothing fancy. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a dirt driveway that disappeared into the trees. No cell phone service, no internet, just an old cabin surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. The kind of place where you hear the wind and the bugs and maybe an owl or two at night. I liked that idea. I arrived late afternoon, my car loaded with food, water, some firewood, and a small stack of books. The sun was dipping behind the trees as I pulled up the gravel path. The cabin was smaller than I expected, with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it had charm. I liked it immediately. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't just the smell of old wood or damp earth. There was something else, faint like a mix of mold and something metallic. It lingered in the air as soon as I stepped inside. I shrugged it off and opened windows to let the fresh air in. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living room with a sagging couch, a wood stove against one wall, a kitchen corner with a rusted sink and old stove, and one bedroom with a narrow bed pushed into the corner. The floor creaked underfoot, and cobwebs hung in some corners, untouched for who knows how long. The walls were bare except for a faded calendar stuck on July 1999, a date so long ago it made me wonder who had been there last. After unpacking, I stacked some firewood by the stove, lit a fire, and settled in. I made myself a simple dinner, heating canned beans over the stove and drinking a cold beer. The quiet was absolute except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I had no phone signal, just like the listing said, so I wasn't expecting any calls or texts. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the hike I planned for the next day. I remember lying awake for a while, listening. The wind rustling the trees sounded like a distant whisper, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled. The wood stove had long since gone cold, and the cabin felt colder than it should have. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around me. Suddenly, a noise, something sharp, quick, scratched against the outer wall of the cabin. I froze. Maybe a branch? A raccoon? I told myself it was nothing, but the noise came again, then again. Slow, deliberate scratches like claws on wood. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight, careful not to turn on the main light and wake myself up fully. I moved toward the window and shined the light out into the darkness. Nothing but trees. No animal, no person. The scratches stopped. I went back to bed but didn't sleep well. Every little sound startled me. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and heavy, pacing near the cabin. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. I was alone here. There was no one else around. The next morning, the sun was bright and warm, and I tried to forget about the night. I went on my hike, climbed a nearby ridge, and took pictures of the vast forest stretching out below. I felt more relaxed, the fresh air clearing my mind. But when I came back to the cabin, something felt off. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left. I always lock doors when I camp, even in remote places. I stepped inside slowly, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. Nothing was missing, but the place looked disturbed. A chair was pushed back, the floor was scuffed, and on the wooden table lay a small pile of dry twigs and leaves that definitely weren't there before. My heart was pounding. I checked all the windows, locked, but smudged as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass. I felt a cold dread creeping in. I was definitely not alone here. I spent the afternoon double-checking the cabin, looking for anything out of place. I found a few more signs, broken twigs around the perimeter, footprints in the soft dirt outside the window, but no clear tracks. Whoever had been here was careful. That night, I kept the fire going and sat close, listening. I kept my flashlight and a heavy stick nearby. I stayed awake most of the night, watching the shadows outside. The next morning, I found fresh footprints right at the edge of the porch. They were big, heavy, and barefoot. No shoes. They went around the cabin in a slow circle, then disappeared into the woods. I knew then that someone had been watching me, maybe living nearby or camping off-trail. But who, why, and what did they want? I thought about leaving, but my car was still in the driveway and the road was long. Besides, I didn't want to panic or jump to conclusions. I told myself to stay calm. The following day was quiet. No noises outside, no footprints, nothing. I used the time to clean up the cabin, light the fire, and read some. I was trying to enjoy the peace despite the unease in my gut. But the real nightmare started that night. I woke up to a thud on the roof. Hard, sharp, like someone had slammed something heavy on the thin cabin roof. Then another thud, then another. Slow, regular, like footsteps. I lay frozen, listening to the sounds above me. Whoever it was on the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stood up, heart racing. I peeked outside the window and saw nothing but black sky and trees. The sound stopped abruptly. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside and looked up at the roof. There were deep dents in the old metal sheets, like heavy boots had stomped on it. I found a few tufts of dark hair caught in the edges of the shingles. My mind raced. It wasn't an animal. No bear or coyote would climb on a roof like that. Someone was up there, watching me, maybe trying to get inside. I checked the perimeter again, looking for a way they could have climbed up. There was a nearby tree with low branches that almost touched the roof. That was probably the way. I realized then that the cabin wasn't as isolated as I thought. Someone could live nearby, hidden in the woods, watching me without me ever knowing. That night, I stayed up all night, lights on, fire burning, and my eyes glued to the windows. I heard the faint sound of branches breaking in the distance. I thought I saw shadows moving between the trees. I felt trapped. On the third day, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, throwing my things into the car and locking the cabin door behind me. As I was about to drive off, I noticed something strange in the dirt next to the driveway. A small pile of stones arranged in a circle, perfectly balanced. It looked like a crude marker or a sign. I didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I started the engine and drove away fast, glancing in the rearview mirror at the cabin disappearing behind me. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I checked my phone obsessively for signal, called a friend to tell them what happened, and stayed in a hotel to feel safe. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin area was notorious for being used by illegal hunters and squatters. People who lived off the grid, hiding from authorities, and sometimes dangerous. The strange noises, the footprints, the roof stomping, they all made sense. I wasn't just unlucky. I had stumbled into a place where people didn't want visitors. The experience left me shaken, and I haven't been back to a cabin since. I still get chills remembering how alone I felt, how every sound made my heart race, and how close danger was without me ever seeing it clearly. That cabin trip wasn't just a getaway. It was a warning. The first time I decided to stay alone in that cabin, I thought it was going to be peaceful, a break from the noise of everyday life, a chance to clear my head. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. The last stretch of road was a narrow, rough dirt path with potholes filled with rainwater, lined by dense trees that swallowed the daylight. No cell signal for miles, no neighbors in sight, just forest all around. I pulled up just before sunset. The cabin was small but solid, a weathered wooden structure with peeling brown paint and a rusty tin roof. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees that stretched up into the sky. A thin chimney puffed a little smoke, the sign someone had been here recently. I felt a flicker of relief that the place wasn't abandoned, but also a small unease I pushed aside. Inside, the air was stale and smelled like damp wood and old pine needles. The furniture was simple and worn. A cracked wooden table, a couple of mismatched chairs, a cot pushed against one wall. A metal wood stove stood in the corner with some dry logs stacked beside it. The only source of light came from a few grimy windows with threadbare curtains. There was no electricity, no running water, just the essentials to live off the grid for a few days. I unpacked slowly, setting out canned food, a small portable stove, a flashlight, and my sleeping bag. The silence was thick, almost heavy. No birdsong, no rustling animals. Just the distant sound of wind moving through the branches. I figured the wilderness would sound alive at night. Wolves howling, maybe an owl. But the forest was oddly quiet. I built a small fire in the stove, letting the warmth spread through the room. The glow gave the cabin a strange, cozy feeling, though the shadows stretched long across the wooden floor. I sat down by the fire and looked out the window. The sky had darkened to a deep navy, the last rays of sun disappearing behind the trees. The forest outside looked black and still, like it was holding its breath. That night, I tried to sleep on the cot, but it was thin and hard. The walls creaked occasionally, probably just the wood settling, I told myself. But every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging slowly over bark. I shook my head and tried to ignore it. I didn't know then how long I would be here, but I planned to stay for a few days, just me, the cabin, and the forest. The next morning, I woke early to the smell of pine and cold air slipping through the cracks in the window frames. The sky was gray and overcast. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The ground was soft and damp from recent rain, with patches of moss growing on rocks and fallen logs. I walked slowly through the trees, listening for any sounds, but the forest remained eerily silent. After about an hour, I found an old, overgrown trail leading further into the woods. The path was barely visible, choked by weeds and fallen branches. I debated whether to follow it, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed through the underbrush, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. The trail twisted and wound for a few hundred yards before ending abruptly at a small clearing. In the middle stood a rusted metal barrel, tipped on its side and half buried in the dirt. Around it were scattered pieces of broken glass and what looked like a few empty beer cans. The whole place had a neglected, abandoned feel. Something about it made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. I turned back toward the cabin, my footsteps crunching on dry leaves. The silence seemed deeper now, like the forest was watching me. That night, the scratching noise came back, louder and closer. It wasn't just on the walls anymore. It seemed to be outside, right against the windows. I sat frozen, gripping the flashlight in my hands. The beam of light didn't reach far through the darkness, but I could make out strange shapes moving just beyond the glass. Shadows that didn't look like any animal I knew. Sleep was impossible. The next day, I tried to distract myself with chores. I collected firewood, fixed a loose board on the porch, and boiled water on the stove. But the unease kept building. I found more signs of other people. A torn piece of cloth snagged on a branch, footprints near the clearing, and strange symbols crudely carved into a tree trunk. They didn't look like anything I recognized. The more I noticed, the more I felt like I was not alone. By the third night, the cabin felt like a trap. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. The scratching turned into thumping, heavy, rhythmic banging on the walls, like something trying to get in. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might burst. I stayed awake all night, watching the windows, flashlight ready, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. But when dawn finally broke, the forest was calm again. I decided to leave first thing in the morning. Packing quickly, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The drive back down the dirt road was tense. The sun was rising, but the forest still felt dark and threatening. Later, safe at home, I looked up the cabin's history. It had been used years ago by hunters and trappers, but there were stories about squatters and drug users hiding out in the woods. The symbols I'd seen carved into the trees matched some gang signs used in the area. The scratching and banging? Probably people trying to scare anyone who came near, to keep the place secret and private. I realized the forest wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was controlled by real people who didn't want to be found. That cabin trip changed how I think about the wilderness. It's not just empty trees and quiet nights. Sometimes, it's a place where people live in the shadows, hiding from the world, and they don't welcome strangers. The scariest thing wasn't the dark or the silence. It was knowing that I had stumbled into someone else's territory, and that I had no way to protect myself. I remember the first time I decided to spend a weekend alone in that cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't a choice made lightly. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a small, wooden shack tucked away in the middle of nowhere, far from the nearest town or any real signs of civilization. The whole place looked like it had been abandoned for years before I got there. The paint peeling off the walls, the porch sagging under the weight of time and weather. But it was mine for the weekend. A place to get away, to clear my head, to just be. I'd grown tired of the city, the noise, the constant buzz of people and cars and endless chatter. Sometimes I needed to be somewhere quiet enough that all I could hear was the wind moving through the trees or the occasional bird's cry. That weekend, the cabin was going to be that place. I packed my car the night before. Some food, a few bottles of water, a sleeping bag, a small camping stove, and a lantern. I didn't bother bringing a phone charger. The cabin had no signal, no power, no internet. It was the perfect excuse to unplug. The drive out there was long and lonely. The closer I got, the narrower and rougher the road became. Dirt and gravel replaced the asphalt, and eventually the road was more a path than a real road. Branches scraped the sides of my car, and I had to slow down to avoid potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The air was cool and smelled like pine and damp earth. I got out, stretched, and looked around. The place was quiet, except for the sound of a nearby creek trickling. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up, and I pushed open the front door. It swung open easily, and I stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and dampness. Dust coated the floor in a thin layer, and cobwebs hung in the corners. There was a small fireplace against one wall, with a stack of firewood nearby. The furniture was sparse: a wooden table with a couple of chairs, a small bed with a faded blanket, and a shelf holding a few cans of food and a dusty old lantern. I set my things down, lit the lantern, and unpacked. I wanted to start a fire in the fireplace, so I gathered some dry wood from the stack and some kindling I found under the floorboards near the hearth. Lighting it took longer than I expected, but soon flames flickered and warmth spread through the room. I sat down at the table with a can of beans and a small tin cup of coffee. The quiet was peaceful, but after a while, it started to feel heavy, like the silence was watching me, waiting for something. I tried to ignore it and read a book I'd brought, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Outside, the trees stood tall and unmoving, their shadows stretching long and dark in the firelight. As night fell, I went to bed early, lying under the thin blanket. The cabin was cold, but the fire kept the room warm enough. I listened to the sounds outside, the crackle of twigs, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I didn't sleep well. Every time I drifted off, a noise outside would wake me. A snap of a branch, a scrape near the window, or the soft crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. But when I looked out, there was nothing there. The next morning, I woke to a dull ache in my back from the hard bed. The sun filtered through the curtains, and I felt a little better. I built another fire and made some coffee. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. Outside, the woods were thick and tangled. The trees were close together, their branches woven into a canopy that made the forest floor dim even in daylight. The ground was soft and damp underfoot, covered in a carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. I wandered along the creek, stepping carefully on the mossy rocks. The water was clear and cold, and I bent down to splash some on my face. I noticed old tire tracks in the mud, though they were faded and probably weeks old. As I walked further, the woods grew darker and quieter. The birds stopped singing, and even the breeze seemed to hush. I found an old logging road, barely visible under years of fallen branches and leaves. The farther I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. Not by anything specific, just a sense like eyes on the back of my neck. I turned back and made my way to the cabin. When I got there, I noticed something odd on the porch. A small pile of broken branches and sticks was stacked near the door. I hadn't left anything like that there. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe some animal had dragged them there. Still, a shiver ran down my spine. Back inside, I decided to check the fireplace for more firewood. As I lifted some logs, my hand brushed something hard and cold beneath the pile. I reached down and pulled out a small, rusty metal box. It was heavy and locked shut. Curious, I looked around for a way to open it. No key, no tools, just the box. The rust had eaten away some of the metal, and with a bit of effort, I pried the lid open. Inside were a few old papers, folded and yellowed with age, and a small knife with a wooden handle, stained dark with something I hoped wasn't blood. I unfolded the papers carefully. They looked like notes written in a hurried, messy hand. One of them read, "Asterisk, they come at night. The men with the guns. The forest isn't safe anymore. If you find this, stay hidden. Don't trust the roads. Don't trust anyone. Asterisk." My heart raced. Who wrote this? And what did they mean by men with the guns? I searched the rest of the notes, but they were just fragments, warnings, pleas, names crossed out. Nothing concrete. Suddenly, a loud noise outside made me jump. It sounded like heavy footsteps on the porch. I grabbed the knife from the box, my hands shaking. I crept to the window and looked out, but all I saw was the empty porch and the dark woods beyond. Minutes passed. No movement, just silence. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day, not daring to go outside. Night came again, and the feeling of being watched returned stronger than before. I heard footsteps again, slower this time, circling the cabin. I stayed quiet, hiding behind the table with the knife in my hand. The footsteps stopped outside the window. I looked through the glass and saw nothing but shadows. Then I heard a faint sound, metal scraping against wood. Someone was trying to force the door open. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the lantern and swung it at the door. The glass shattered against the wood, and the banging stopped. Silence again. I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to get out. I packed my things as quietly as possible, grabbed my jacket, and stepped outside into the cold night. The woods were pitch black, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I followed the dirt road back toward the main road, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps behind me started again, closer this time. I ran. Branches scratched my face and arms, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. After what felt like hours, the road opened up to a small clearing. I saw headlights in the distance, the road, finally. I sprinted toward the light, waving my arms. Car slowed down and I flagged it down. The driver looked confused but let me in. As we drove away, I looked back at the dark woods, the cabin just a small shadow among the trees. I never went back. Later, I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they found nothing. No signs of anyone near the cabin, no evidence of forced entry, no tracks. Just me, the rusty box, and the warnings in those old papers. The forest had a secret, something I'd never understand. But I knew one thing for sure: some places are better left alone. I remember the trip clearly, even now. It was a mix of excitement and unease, but mostly, I just wanted to get away. Away from the city, away from the noise, away from everything that made my life feel heavy and too loud. I found this cabin listed online. Something remote, tucked away in the woods of northern Idaho. Promised silence, isolation, and a chance to disconnect. The photos looked perfect enough. A small wooden cabin, rough but solid, surrounded by thick pine trees. No neighbors for miles. No distractions except the forest. I didn't know the full story behind the cabin when I booked it. I didn't care much for that sort of thing. I just wanted to be alone, to rest, and to maybe write a little bit. The owner's listing said it was an old logging cabin that had been renovated a little. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. There was a dirt road leading up to it, and I was told the last few miles were rough, but my car, a Subaru Outback, could handle it. So I packed up, loaded the car with enough supplies for a week, and drove out there late one Friday afternoon in early fall. The drive was long but beautiful. The highway gave way to smaller roads, then gravel, and finally a dirt track that wove through towering evergreens and thick brush. The sun was starting to set by the time I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin stood. It sat on a slight hill, looking almost like a forgotten relic. The wood was weathered and dark, the windows dusty but intact. I got out and took a deep breath of cold, sharp air. The forest stretched endlessly around me, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant crow. The cabin's porch was small, with a wooden bench and a stack of firewood beside the door. I carried my bags inside. The inside was dim but cozy. A small wood stove sat in one corner, and there was a rough wooden table with 2 chairs. A narrow bed with a thin mattress was pushed against one wall. There were shelves lined with dusty books and old tools. The air smelled of pine and something faintly musty. I set down my things and took a moment to just look around. After lighting a fire in the stove, I unpacked some food and settled in with a notebook. Outside, the last light faded quickly, and soon darkness wrapped the cabin in thick blackness. No streetlights, no cars, nothing but the forest. The silence was overwhelming at first. It felt like the world outside the cabin had disappeared. Only the crackling fire broke the stillness. That first night was restless. The bed creaked, and every small sound, branches scraping against windows, the distant hoot of an owl, the sudden snap of a twig, felt amplified. I told myself it was just the woods, normal noises, nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something just beyond the edges of the firelight. The next morning, I explored a bit. There was a narrow trail leading from the cabin down the hill toward a small creek. The trees were dense, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves and moss. I spent a few hours walking, enjoying the quiet, the smell of damp earth and pine needles. I saw deer tracks, and the occasional squirrel darted through the underbrush. Everything seemed peaceful, untouched. But then I noticed something strange on the trail. A patch of broken branches, crushed grass, and footprints. They looked fresh, too fresh. They weren't human footprints, though, not exactly. Too large and irregular. I took pictures with my phone and went back to the cabin, trying not to let my imagination run wild. The second night was worse. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and pushing cold drafts into the cabin. The fire struggled to stay lit. I woke several times to the sound of heavy footsteps outside, just beyond the porch. They were slow, deliberate, like something large moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably a bear or maybe a large deer, but the weight and the rhythm felt off. I got up once, grabbed my flashlight and a heavy branch, and stepped outside into the cold air. The forest was dark and silent. The the beam of the flashlight cutting through the blackness. I shone it across the clearing into the trees. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected back. No sounds except the wind and distant crows. I stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, waiting for something to show up. Nothing came. I went back inside and bolted the door. The next day, I tried to keep busy. I chopped more firewood, cleaned up the cabin, and tried to write, but the unease was gnawing at me. I kept hearing sounds outside, branches snapping, the faint crunch of footsteps. But every time I looked out the window or went outside to check, there was nothing. The woods looked empty and still. On the third night, the sounds got worse. It was just after midnight when I heard something heavy scraping against the side of the cabin. It was slow and deliberate, like claws or hooves dragging across the wood. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door slowly, peeking out. The porch was empty. The forest swallowed any detail in shadows. I shone the flashlight along the edge of the clearing and saw deep scratches on the wood siding of the cabin. Long, uneven claw marks gouged the surface. I had never noticed them before. The wood was old and weathered, but these marks were fresh. I ran my hand along the scratches, feeling the rough splinters. Then I noticed something else. The firewood stack was disturbed. Several logs were knocked over, scattered across the porch. And worse, some of the firewood was split and crushed as if something heavy had smashed it. I stared into the dark woods, feeling exposed and vulnerable. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept the fire burning bright, the door locked and bolted, and the windows covered with heavy blankets. Every few minutes, I'd hear heavy breathing or rustling outside, close enough to make me flinch. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes glued to the windows, clutching a kitchen knife. When the first light broke through the trees, I stepped outside cautiously. The forest looked calm, peaceful even. I searched around the cabin and found deep footprints in the soft earth near the porch. They were enormous, far bigger than any bear or large animal I'd seen before. The prints were uneven and messy, as if the creature had been limping or dragging something. I took pictures again, trying to capture the details. I felt cold despite the rising sun. My phone had no signal, no way to call for help. The nearest town was over an hour away by car, and the road out was rough and narrow. I was completely isolated. The next 2 days were a strange blur of unease and exhaustion. I tried to stay busy, but the fear hung over me like a cloud. At night, the sounds came back. Heavy footsteps, scraping, rustling in the bushes, and once, a deep growl that seemed to echo all around the clearing. I never saw anything clearly, always just shadows moving in the dark. One morning, I woke up to find the firewood completely scattered across the porch again. More scratches on the cabin walls. A small patch of the forest near the cabin was flattened, as if something large had been resting or sleeping there. I couldn't explain any of it. I felt like I was being stalked by something, but whatever it was, it never showed itself fully. By the 5th day, I was desperate to leave. I packed my things quickly and prepared the car. Before I left, I walked around the clearing one last time, trying to take it all in. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A set of old, rusted bear traps partially buried in the dirt near the edge of the woods, hidden by leaves and branches. They looked like they had been there for years, but some of the mechanisms were fresh, as if someone had recently set them. The thought hit me like a punch. Maybe the cabin had once been a hunter's hideout, or someone trapping animals illegally. Maybe whatever was out there was a bear, or a large predator, caught and wounded, angry and desperate. Or maybe something else. I got in the car and started the engine, the sound loud in the quiet clearing. As I drove away, I kept glancing back at the cabin, feeling eyes watching me from the trees. I didn't stop until I reached the highway and the safety of the open road. Looking back now, I'm sure of one thing. That cabin was never just a quiet place to get away. It was a trap, in a way. A place where something wild had made its home, and where I wasn't welcome. The marks on the cabin, the heavy footsteps, the smashed firewood, the rusted traps. They were all signs that I had walked into a dangerous, living wilderness that didn't want visitors. I never went back, and I don't plan to. The memory of those long nights, the heavy sounds outside, and the feeling of being hunted still haunts me. Not in the ghost story way, but in a real, raw way, the kind of fear you get when you realize the wild isn't just beautiful or peaceful. It can be ruthless, unpredictable, and deadly. And sometimes it's better to just leave it alone. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. After months of work grinding away in a cramped city apartment, I desperately needed some time alone in nature to reset. A simple weekend away, just me and the woods. I found a small cabin to rent about 4 hours north, deep in the mountains. It wasn't fancy, no electricity, no cell service, just a tiny wooden cabin with a wood stove and a well out back. Exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully: water, canned food, a lantern with extra fuel, a thick wool blanket, my hiking boots, and enough firewood to keep warm. I made sure my backpack had all the basics: a first aid kit, a map of the area, a compass, and a sturdy knife. I'd never been alone out this deep before, but I was confident. The cabin was at the end of a dirt road with no neighbors for miles. Perfect solitude. The drive was long and winding, the highway fading into a narrow gravel path that bounced my little car like a bucking horse. Eventually, the trees closed in tight on either side, towering pines blotting out the sun. The air smelled clean and fresh: pine needles, damp earth, and the faint scent of wood smoke from some distant chimney. I turned off the road when a small sign marked the cabin's name: Whispering Pines. The irony wasn't lost on me. The cabin itself was a squat, boxy structure made of rough-hewn logs, darkened by years of weather and smoke stains. A rusted metal roof gleamed dull silver under the afternoon sun. The porch sagged slightly, with a single rocking chair that creaked faintly in the wind. I parked my car nearby, grabbed my gear, and stepped inside. The cabin was cold and dim inside, the only light coming through a few grimy windows. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of mold and old wood. Against one wall sat a small cast-iron wood stove, its flue pipe disappearing through the ceiling. The cabin had a tiny kitchen corner, a metal sink with a hand pump, a shelf holding a few canned goods left behind by the previous renter. The bedroom was just a corner with a thin mattress on a wooden frame. Simple, bare, and just what I expected. I set about unpacking and getting a fire going. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping low behind the ridges. The first few attempts to light the stove failed. The damp wood just smoked and smoldered. After a few tries, I finally got a small fire burning, the faint crackle of flame warming the space. Outside, the forest was eerily silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. The wind stirred the branches, making the shadows dance. I ate a simple dinner: canned beans heated on the stove, a stale piece of bread, then settled in with a book. The cabin was peaceful in its own way, but something about the stillness felt strange. The quiet wasn't comforting. It felt like waiting. That night, I struggled to sleep. The mattress was thin and uncomfortable. The cold seeped in around the edges of the windows, and the wind outside howled through the trees like a restless animal. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a twig outside, seemed amplified in the silence. I kept imagining eyes watching me from the woods, though I knew logically there was no one there. Sometime before dawn, I woke up suddenly. The wood stove had died down to glowing embers, and the room was bitter cold. I heard a faint scratching sound coming from outside, near the cabin. My heart hammered. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons or squirrels maybe, but the noise was persistent, a soft but deliberate scraping against the cabin's outer wall. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The cold night air hit me instantly, and my breath came out in a cloud. The beam of the flashlight swept over the ground near the porch. I saw nothing but scattered pine needles and a few dry leaves. No animals, no signs of movement. I checked around the cabin but found no tracks or marks. Still, the scratching continued intermittently, mostly near the back. I decided it was probably some rodent or bird pecking at the wood. The cabin was old, and I wouldn't be surprised if animals had taken shelter in its nooks and crannies. I closed the door and bolted it firmly, then wrapped myself tightly in the blanket. It was going to be a long night. Morning brought some relief. The sun rose bright and warm, chasing the cold away. I brewed some coffee over the stove and ate a cold granola bar. I wanted to explore the area to clear my head, so I packed a day pack with water, a knife, and the map. The forest around the cabin was thick and wild, with narrow trails just wide enough for a single person. I followed a path downhill that led to a small creek. The water was clear and icy cold, trickling over smooth stones. I filled my water bottle and rested on a large rock, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves. The forest here was beautiful but isolated. No other cabins or signs of human life in sight. As the day wore on, I felt a creeping unease again. The forest seemed different than the usual peaceful wilderness I knew. The trees stood close and tall, blocking the horizon. The undergrowth was thick and tangled, and the path was overgrown in places. My footsteps echoed strangely in the stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I saw nothing. Returning to the cabin in late afternoon, I noticed something odd. The woodpile beside the cabin, which I'd stacked neatly the night before, had been disturbed. Some logs were scattered on the ground, and a few had scratch marks on them. My heart quickened. I looked around but saw no footprints or clear signs of who or what had been there. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked tight. The sun was dropping fast now, and the woods darkened quickly beneath the thick canopy. I built the fire stove back up with fresh wood, the flames licking higher and warming the cabin's interior. I tried to push the fear down and focus on practical things: food, warmth, shelter. Night fell again, bringing the same cold, heavy silence. I tried to sleep, but the sounds outside were louder this time. Occasional thumps, branches breaking, and that same scratching near the walls. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and causing the cabin to groan. At some point, I woke up to a loud banging on the door. My blood ran cold. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding in the dark. The banging came again, heavy and deliberate. Whoever or whatever was outside wanted in. I shined my flashlight toward the door and called out, but there was no reply. The banging stopped suddenly. I listened for any sound but heard nothing. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or awake. I grabbed my knife from the bedside and waited, tense and shivering. After what felt like hours, dawn finally came. Exhausted, I cautiously opened the door to check outside. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, but there were no footprints. Instead, there were deep gouges scratched into the wood siding, long, jagged marks as if something sharp had clawed at the cabin's exterior. I sat on the porch, heart racing, trying to make sense of it. No animals I knew could make marks like that on thick wood, at least not repeatedly around a human shelter. The thought of a wild animal was terrifying, but something about the deliberate scratching and banging felt more intelligent. I debated leaving immediately, but my car was parked down a narrow, winding road. If something was out there in the woods, I had to be careful. I spent the morning preparing. I packed my things quickly, stacked my firewood, and cleaned up the cabin as best I could. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something else. The well outside the cabin, an old stone structure capped with a rusted metal cover, had its lid shifted open slightly. I hadn't touched it. The well was deep and narrow, and the cover was heavy. Whoever or whatever was out there had been messing around it. I locked the cabin door one last time and headed toward the car. The forest seemed darker now, the trees casting long shadows even in the bright morning sun. As I walked the path, I kept looking over my shoulder. The silence was suffocating, like the woods were holding their breath. When I reached the car, I found something even more unsettling. Scratches covered the driver's side door, deep, long, messy gouges. The paint was torn and the metal bent in places. Whoever had done this had been close enough to reach the car. There were no footprints around, just the marks on the door. I slammed the door shut, started the engine, and backed out quickly. The gravel road rattled beneath the tires as I sped away, my heart pounding. The cabin, the woods, the silence. Something there didn't want me to leave, or maybe didn't want anyone there at all. Later, once I was back in cell range, I called the local ranger station. They told me that the area had reports of a large, aggressive mountain lion recently spotted nearby, responsible for some attacks on hikers and campers. The scratches and banging could fit with a large cat testing or marking its territory, or even trying to get inside the cabin out of curiosity or hunger. I realized I'd been lucky. The animal must have been stalking me, investigating the cabin and the car, waiting for a chance. It was a reminder that out here, in the wild, it started out as a simple trip. Just me, a weekend alone in the woods, away from everything and everyone. I needed that. My job had been overwhelming lately. Deadlines, people expecting constant answers, and the endless hum of the city wearing on my nerves. I told myself I just wanted to recharge, to disconnect. The idea was straightforward. Rent a cabin in the mountains, spend 2 days by myself, read, hike a little, and come back feeling calmer. That's all. The cabin I found was about 3 hours from my apartment, tucked away in a national forest in the northern part of the state. Nothing fancy, just a small wooden cabin built maybe 50 years ago, but still standing solid. It was isolated. No neighbors, no cell service, just the woods surrounding it from every side. I liked the thought of that kind of quiet. I packed my car the night before leaving. A small bag with some clothes, a few books, basic food supplies, and a bottle of water. I also brought a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a folding knife my dad had given me years ago. I figured the knife was a good idea just in case. I didn't expect to use it, but better to have it. The drive was long but peaceful. The highway gave way to smaller, winding roads. Trees thickened on either side, their branches reaching across the road like fingers. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows. The dirt road to the cabin was narrow and rough, barely wide enough for my car. At points, I had to slow to a crawl, navigating potholes and loose gravel. When I finally arrived, the cabin was sitting in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and earth. The cabin looked exactly as the pictures had shown. Weathered wood, a small porch with a couple of chairs, a stone chimney, and a rusty metal roof. No lights inside, of course, but I had brought a lantern. I unloaded my stuff, locked the car, and took a slow walk around the cabin to get a feel for the place. The woods were silent except for the occasional bird or the distant rustling of leaves. No wind to speak of, just a heavy stillness that seemed to press in around me. I stepped onto the porch and tested the door. It creaked as I opened it, the hinges complaining after what I guessed was years of little use. Inside, the cabin was basic. A small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a couch that looked stiff and uncomfortable, and a bedroom with a single bed pushed against the wall. A window looked out over the clearing, and I made a note to check the locks. I hadn't seen any other cabins or signs of people nearby, but I wasn't counting on that being a guarantee of safety. I lit a fire in the stove and set up the lantern on the table. The warm glow pushed back the shadows in the room, but the corners still held deep darkness. I put on a pot of water to boil for tea and sat down with a book. Night crept in quickly. The fire crackled and popped as I read, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That's the funny thing about being alone in the woods. It makes your mind jump to places it normally wouldn't. Every snap of a twig outside made me glance up. Every owl call made me tense. I told myself to relax, that I was just letting the silence get to me. By the time I got tired, I put the book down and headed to bed. The bed was thin and not very comfortable, but I was exhausted. I locked the door, closed the windows, and switched off the lantern. The room fell into darkness. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the forest outside. The woods didn't sleep. I could hear animals moving around, the occasional distant howl of a coyote, maybe a deer brushing through the undergrowth. The sounds were normal, but they still made me uneasy. I thought about turning on the flashlight or reading some more, but I forced myself to close my eyes. I'm not sure how long I'd been lying there when I heard it. A faint sound, almost a whisper, but not quite. more like a rustling or a scraping. It was coming from outside the cabin, maybe near the porch. I froze, straining to hear. The sound stopped. My heart was beating faster now, but I told myself it was probably an animal. Eventually, I fell asleep. Morning light filtered through the window, soft and pale. I woke up feeling stiff but glad to be alive. Last night's noises were probably just wildlife. I convinced myself of that. I made breakfast on the wood stove, cooked some eggs, and drank strong coffee. After eating, I decided to explore the woods a bit. I grabbed my backpack, filled my water bottle, and stepped outside. The forest was peaceful in the daylight. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making patterns on the ground. I followed a trail that I noticed while walking around the cabin the night before. It wasn't marked on any map, but it looked like it had been used recently. I walked for about an hour, enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. I stopped at a small stream to refill my bottle and rest. The water was cold and clear, and I drank deeply. As I sat there, I noticed something odd: tracks in the mud. Not animal tracks, but footprints. Big, heavy, and deep, as if whoever made them was carrying weight. I looked around for signs of where they might lead, but the forest floor was covered in thick leaves, making it hard to follow. I took a picture with my phone, but there was no signal to send it anywhere. I shrugged and kept walking, but the feeling of being watched returned. It was subtle, like a weight pressing on the back of my neck. I tried to stay calm. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon reading and jotting notes in a small notebook. The woods looked less inviting as the sun lowered. The shadows grew longer and the air got cooler. I made dinner, canned chili heated on the stove, and sat by the fire. The cabin was warmer now. I was starting to get comfortable, thinking about how nice this weekend had been so far. Then I noticed something strange. The front door, which I had locked in the morning, was slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. I was sure I had locked it. The lock was a simple latch, but it didn't just open on its own. I checked the rest of the cabin, windows and back door, all secure. Nothing else was disturbed. Nothing was missing. I closed and locked the door again, then pushed a heavy chair in front of it. I double-checked the windows and stove. Nothing seemed out of place inside. Still, the feeling of unease settled over me like a fog. Night fell again, thicker this time. I kept the fire burning in the stove and the lantern on. I tried to distract myself with my book, but I kept glancing at the door. Then I heard it again, that faint scraping noise. This time it was clearer, closer. Outside the cabin, near the porch. I stood up, my heart hammering. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door slowly. The beam cut through the dark, lighting up the porch and the clearing beyond. Nothing was there. I shone the light in every direction. The forest was quiet except for the rustling of leaves in a light breeze. I stepped down from the porch and looked around. Then I saw it. On the ground, just outside the door, was a small pile of sticks arranged in a rough circle. They looked like someone had stacked them there recently. I crouched down, examining the sticks. They were ordinary twigs and small branches from the nearby trees. No writing, no symbols, just a simple pile. Still, it was deliberate. Someone had been here. Someone who knew I was here. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, but the dirt road back to civilization was still a 3-hour drive. I wasn't sure I could safely pack up and drive at night. I decided to stay, but I took precautions. I checked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for other signs. I found more footprints, the same heavy ones from before, leading away from the cabin into the deeper woods. I couldn't tell if they were fresh or old. I kept the knife close and the lantern burning in the evening. I avoided going outside after dark. By the second night, the sounds outside the cabin changed. It was no longer just animals moving through the woods. I heard low thuds and rustling near the tree line, like someone was walking slowly, keeping to the shadows. Sleep was impossible. On the third day, I finally saw a figure. It was early morning, just after dawn. I was making coffee on the porch when I caught a movement between the trees about 50 yards away. I froze. A man stepped into the clearing, tall, lean, wearing dirty clothes and a baseball cap pulled low. His face was rough, with a scruffy beard and sharp eyes that watched me closely. I didn't move. He didn't speak or wave. He just stood there, staring. I grabbed my phone and raised it like I was going to take a picture. No signal. The man noticed and shook his head slowly, as if warning me. He started walking toward me, slowly. My heart pounded. I backed into the cabin and locked the door. The man stopped at the edge of the clearing, still watching. After a long moment, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't stay another minute. I packed my stuff quickly, double-checked everything, and locked the cabin behind me. I kept the knife in my hand as I drove away on the rough dirt road, eyes darting between the I remember the cabin trip like it was yesterday, though it happened several years ago. It was one of those things I didn't expect to turn into a real nightmare, just a simple weekend getaway gone wrong, but it left a mark I still think about. It started with the plan to get away from the city for a couple of days. I was burnt out from work, tired of the noise and people, and the idea of a quiet cabin in the woods sounded perfect. I had found a small rental cabin online, something off the beaten path, tucked away in a forested area about 4 hours from the city. The listing looked nice, old but well-kept, with a wood stove and a small porch. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just pure isolation. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long but peaceful. The road got narrower and bumpier the closer I got to the cabin. Trees lined both sides, thick and dark, casting long shadows even in the late afternoon. The sun was starting to set when I pulled into the gravel driveway, which was more of a clearing than a proper parking spot. The cabin sat back from the road, mostly hidden by pines and firs, with a thin trail leading up to the front door. I parked, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the cabin. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the smell of pine mixed with a faint dampness filled the air. The cabin looked even older up close. Weathered boards, some warped and cracked, and windows dusty from lack of use. But it had a charm I liked. The kind of place that felt honest, no frills, just wood and nature. I stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, like it hadn't seen fresh air in a while. The floor was rough hardwood, worn smooth in spots. A small kitchen area was to the right with a cast iron stove, a sink with a tiny window above it, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. On the left was a small living space with a couch and a wood stove set against the far wall. The back of the cabin had a door leading outside, and a narrow stairway led upstairs to what looked like a loft bedroom. I dropped my bags and went straight to the kitchen to get some water. The faucet turned, and water came out rusty but clear. I filled a bottle and took a long drink, feeling the chill cool down my throat. After setting my things down, I went outside onto the porch, looking around. The forest stretched out in all directions, dense and quiet except for the occasional bird call or rustling leaves. It was dusk by then, and the sky was streaked with orange and purple. I took a deep breath, feeling the stress of the city begin to fade. This was what I needed. I unpacked my sleeping bag and settled in for the night. I built a fire in the wood stove, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin as the night grew darker. There was no electricity, so the only light came from the fire and a few candles I brought with me. The silence was complete except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I had no cell signal, no internet, just me and the woods. It felt strange but good at the same time. I went to bed early, listening to the sounds outside. The wind whispering through the trees, the snap of twigs, distant animal calls. Felt safe, even peaceful. But it didn't last. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. At first, it was faint, like a soft scraping sound coming from outside the cabin. I lay still, heart beating a little faster, trying to convince myself it was just an animal moving around. Then I heard it again, scraping closer this time, like something was dragging across the wooden steps of the porch. My skin prickled. I got up quietly, grabbed a flashlight from my bag, and tiptoed to the window. I pointed the beam outside but saw nothing, only shadows and dark shapes of trees. The noise stopped. I waited, heart pounding, but the rest of the night was quiet. The next morning, I went outside to check. The porch steps had long scratch marks across the wood, deep enough to look like claws or nails had been dragged across them. That made my stomach twist. I thought it was strange, but I tried to brush it off. Probably some wild animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear. It was a remote place after all. That day, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. I packed a small bag with water, a knife, and a flashlight, and followed a trail that started near the back door. The forest was thick, filled with towering trees, ferns, and moss-covered rocks. Birds flew overhead, and the smell of wet earth and pine was strong. The trail was overgrown and rough, but easy enough to follow. After a while, I came across an old fire pit with charred logs and stones arranged in a circle. Someone had camped here before, probably years ago. Around the fire pit were scattered bits of trash. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, broken glass. I felt uneasy. It was clear the spot had been used by people who didn't care much about the place. I walked back to the cabin as the sun started to set again, thinking about what I'd seen. The forest felt different now, less peaceful, like something was watching. That night, I kept the fire going longer and made sure the door was locked tight. Around midnight, the noise came back. This time it was louder and more persistent, scraping and banging on the porch, like someone or something was trying to get in. I sat frozen on the couch, flashlight in hand, my mind racing. I wanted to call for help, but there was no signal. The banging stopped after a few minutes, and I waited in silence until dawn, too scared to sleep. In the morning, I found footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They looked like heavy boots, too large for a typical hiker or camper. The prints led away into the forest but were fresh, as if whoever had been there the night before was still close. I realized I wasn't alone. I thought about packing up and leaving right away, but something kept me there. Part stubbornness, part curiosity. The next day, I stayed inside, keeping the doors locked and the windows covered. I found some old hunting rifles in the cabin's closet and cleaned them as best as I could. I had never fired a gun before, but I figured it was better than nothing. That night was the worst. The banging started again, but this time the noise came from all around the cabin. Scratching on the windows, pounding on the walls, heavy footsteps stomping through the leaves. I huddled near the wood stove, clutching a rifle, heart pounding so loud I thought it would burst out of my chest. Hours passed, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. I stayed awake until sunrise, watching every shadow. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside to find more signs of someone, or something, having been there. Not just footprints, but strange marks carved into the trees nearby. They looked like crude symbols or warnings. I didn't understand them, but they made my skin crawl. I knew then I had to get out. Whatever was here wasn't just a wild animal. It was someone or some people watching me, maybe waiting. I packed quickly, grabbed what I could carry, and locked the cabin behind me. As I walked back down the trail to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, where I finally got a weak cell signal and called for help. Later, I found out the area was known for illegal activity, drug deals, squatters, and sometimes violent trespassers. The cabin was on land where no one patrolled regularly. The people I disturbed weren't used to visitors and definitely didn't want to share their territory. That weekend changed how I think about getting away. I learned the hard way that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people and the dangers they bring. It started as a simple weekend getaway. I needed time off from work, a real break from the city noise, the constant buzz of emails, texts, and meetings. So I rented a cabin up in the mountains, far enough from civilization to feel completely cut off, but close enough that I could still get back to town if I needed to. The listing said it was a small, rustic cabin nestled in dense woods, about 20 miles from the nearest highway. Perfect. I packed my car the night before, nothing fancy, just a sleeping bag, some canned food, water, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a pocket knife. I wanted to keep it simple, just me and the woods for a couple of days. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. I didn't expect to come close to losing myself in that quiet wilderness. The drive was long but peaceful. I took the winding mountain roads, surrounded by tall pine trees. The air smelled fresh and clean, nothing like the stale city air I'd been breathing for weeks. When I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly like the pictures. Small and made of weathered wood, a little porch with a few old chairs, a stone chimney with no smoke rising from it. The place looked like it hadn't changed much in decades. I parked, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The cabin smelled like damp wood and old smoke. It had a single main room with a small kitchen area, a table, a wood stove, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft where the bed was. I opened the windows to let in fresh air. Outside, the forest pressed close to the edges of the cabin, thick with underbrush and tall trees whose branches scraped the windows in the wind. I spent the first day walking around the area, taking pictures, just soaking in the solitude. The woods were quiet except for the occasional bird or rustle in the bushes. I found an old trail that led to a small creek. The water was cold and clear, trickling over smooth rocks. I sat there for a long time just watching and listening. Felt like I'd stepped out of time. That night, I built a fire in the wood stove and cooked some canned beans. The warmth filled the room, pushing back the chill that crept in as the sun set. Outside, the forest fell silent. No cars, no planes, just the sounds of the night. The occasional snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl. I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the hike. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up. Something felt off. The air inside the cabin was too still, too heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I got up quietly and looked out the window. The forest was black, shadows merging together. My flashlight was on the table and I grabbed it. I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked tight. Still, the feeling stayed with me. I sat back down on the bed, flashlight in hand, and waited for the dawn. The next day was more unsettling. I found footprints around the cabin. Deep, heavy prints that didn't match mine or any animals I knew. They were human, big and wet as if someone had walked through mud. The prints led into the woods but didn't come back. I thought maybe some hunter or camper had been around earlier, but I hadn't seen any cars or heard any voices. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. I spent the day exploring more trails and collecting wood for the stove. The forest seemed normal during the day, but I kept feeling eyes on me. I felt like something or someone was watching from just beyond the tree line, always staying just out of sight. That night, the feeling got worse. I could hear footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. Not the light padding of animals, but heavy, crunching steps on dead leaves and broken twigs. The sound circled the cabin, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I stayed awake with the flashlight, heart pounding, waiting for dawn. I didn't hear any voices or see anyone, but the steps were unmistakable. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, ready to drive back to the city and forget this place ever existed. But as I started my car, I noticed something on the windshield. A small, crudely drawn symbol scratched into the glass. It was just a simple shape, a circle with lines crossing inside it. I had no idea what it meant. I wiped it off, locked the cabin, and drove away as fast as I could. Back in town, I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. Maybe some local kids had been messing around, or maybe I was just paranoid from being alone in the woods. But the memory of those footsteps and the scratched symbol haunted me. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I called the rental agency and asked about the cabin. They told me it had been rented only a few times in the past year. Some renters had left early, complaining about strange noises or feeling unsafe. One previous renter mentioned seeing a man in the woods watching the cabin, but no one ever found anyone. The agency said the place was safe, but I knew better. Then I started hearing news reports about break-ins and robberies in the surrounding mountain areas. People were getting targeted by a group of thieves who lived rough in the woods, preying on hikers and renters. That explained the footprints, the nighttime footsteps. Someone had been watching the cabin, waiting for a chance to get inside or catch me off guard. It wasn't ghosts or legends. It was real danger, a hidden threat lurking close to where I'd stayed. The scratch symbol was likely a mark, a warning, or a sign for others who knew the area. The fear I felt was real because someone was out there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike if I stayed. In the end, I realized how foolish I'd been to think the woods were peaceful just because they were quiet. Silence doesn't mean safety. The cabin was just a trap disguised as solitude. I never went back, and when I tell people about it, I warn them, nature can be unforgiving, but people living off the grid can be even more dangerous. The woods hold their own secrets, but the most terrifying things aren't always what you see or hear. Sometimes, they're the things you don't see, the footsteps just out of sight, the eyes watching from the shadows, and the marks left behind to warn the next visitor to stay away. The sun was already low when I finally reached the cabin deep in the woods. I had been driving all day, winding down narrow country roads, past farms and small towns, following a GPS coordinate that promised solitude and a chance to disconnect from the world for a few days. The road became a dirt track, full of potholes and loose rocks, and I had to slow down almost to a crawl, eyes peeled for any sign of other cars or people. But there was nothing, just dense trees and the low hum of insects in the late afternoon heat. The cabin itself was small and rustic, made of dark, weathered wood with a metal roof that gleamed faintly in the fading light. It looked sturdy enough, though you could tell it hadn't been touched in a while. The porch was sagging slightly on one side, and the windows were dirty, coated in a layer of dust and cobwebs. A rusted old lantern hung from a hook near the door. The whole place had that unmistakable smell of damp wood, moss, and something faintly sour, maybe mildew. I pulled my bags from the car, unlocked the door with a key I found in a plastic bag taped to the mailbox, and stepped inside. The air inside was cooler but stale. Dust particles floated in the shafts of light cutting through the grimy windows. The floor creaked under my boots, and the smell of old wood mixed with something sharp, like rust or burnt metal. There was a small living area with a sagging couch and a table covered in old newspapers and dried leaves. The kitchen was little more than a corner with a rusty stove and a sink with no running water. A small pile of firewood leaned against one wall. I dropped my bags by the door and took a moment to breathe. I was alone here, no cell service, no internet, no sounds except for the faint rustling of leaves outside. This was the whole point of the trip, to get away from noise, from people, from everything. I set about unpacking, lighting a candle on the table to fight the encroaching darkness. The sun slipped beneath the horizon, and the cabin was plunged into shadows. Outside, the forest seemed to close in, the trees no longer mere trees but looming shapes, their branches like fingers scraping the sky. I started a small fire in the old stone hearth. The dry wood crackled, casting a warm glow against the walls. The soft light revealed more details. Cracks in the wood, scratches on the floorboards, and patches where the paint had peeled away. I lay on the old couch later, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ceiling. The quiet was thick and almost suffocating. At first, it was peaceful, the kind of silence you can only find far from civilization. But after a while, it started to feel different, heavy, like the quiet was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, just the usual nerves of being alone in a strange place. But the feeling didn't go away. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, it was faint, a scrape, like something dragging against the side of the cabin. My heart pounded, and I sat up, listening intently. Outside, the wind was low, but I could hear the faintest crunch of leaves, like someone or something was moving slowly through the brush. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about the noise wasn't right. It was deliberate, slow, almost cautious. It repeated scrape, pause, scrape. I forced myself to stand, grabbed the flashlight I had brought, and crept to the window. Peering out into the blackness, I saw nothing but shadows. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches knocking together. I waited a few minutes, eyes straining, but no movement. I told myself to calm down, that the forest was alive at night and sounds carried differently. I put the flashlight down and went back to the couch, but sleep didn't come easy after that. Every small noise made me jump. The cracking of wood, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. The next morning, sunlight poured in through the windows, washing away the night's tension. I made coffee on the old stove and sat on the porch, listening to birds and the faint buzz of insects. The forest looked peaceful, even beautiful. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The trees were thick, tall pines and oaks, with thick underbrush that made walking difficult. The ground was uneven, scattered with fallen branches and rocks. As I walked, I noticed something odd. Footprints. Deep, wide prints, too large to be human, pressed into the soft earth. They circled the cabin, disappearing into the trees. The shape was hard to make out, but the size was clear. These prints weren't from any animal I knew. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, but told myself it was probably a bear or some other large animal. I marked the trail with a stick and headed back to the cabin, deciding to keep an eye out for any other signs. That night, the noises came again, this time louder. Heavy footsteps pacing just beyond the cabin, accompanied by low, guttural sounds, almost growls but not quite. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I stayed as still and quiet as possible. The fire had burned down to embers, and I was too afraid to get up and add more wood. The pacing continued for what felt like hours, then stopped abruptly. Silence. Then, a soft tapping on the window. Not a loud bang, just a careful, slow tapping. My heart raced. I wanted to look, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and the night went quiet again. The next day, I found more signs around the cabin. Claw marks, deep scratches gouged into the wood of the porch railing and the cabin walls. They looked fresh, too fresh to be old damage. I found torn bits of fabric snagged on branches near the edge of the clearing, possibly from something brushing past or trying to get in. The forest felt less peaceful now. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. Even the birds were quieter. I thought about leaving, but the nearest town was over 2 hours away on these rough roads, and my car was low on gas. Besides, I wanted to understand what was happening here. Something about the place called to me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was watching me. That night, I made sure the fire was large and steady before I settled in. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair, and I kept the flashlight and a large kitchen knife close at hand. The tapping came again, but this time more urgent. It moved from window to window, circling the cabin like a slow dance. At one point, I heard something heavier, like a body hitting the porch steps, then scraping as it moved along the wall. I forced myself to stay quiet, heart thudding in my ears. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then, just before dawn, the noises stopped. The forest slowly came back to life with the first birdsong. I slept poorly, waking at the slightest sound. The next morning, I found the biggest clue yet. A single, large footprint pressed into the soft mud near the cabin. It was enormous, bigger than any bear print I had ever seen. The shape was wrong for any known animal, with a broad, flat sole and thick toes ending in blunt nails. The edges were clear, pressed deep as if the creature weighed hundreds of pounds. Nearby, I found something else. A pile of sticks and stones arranged carefully in a circle, almost like a crude trap or marker. The ground around it was trampled, as if whatever had made it had been watching the cabin from close by. I packed quickly that day, my nerves on edge. The cabin no longer felt like a place to rest, but a trap waiting to close. I kept my eyes on the tree line as I loaded my bags. Every crack, every movement made me freeze. Just as I was about to get in the car, I heard it. A low growl, deep and throaty, coming from just beyond the clearing. The sound wasn't animal, not exactly. It was something older, primal, and full of warning. I jumped into the car and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced back once more. In the shadows between the trees, I saw a dark shape, huge, hulking, and still. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, the forest and cabin far behind me. I never went back. In the end, I realized that some places are home to things that don't belong to us, creatures that don't need to make sense, that exist outside of our rules. The forest had its guardian, whatever it was, and I was a trespasser. It wasn't about ghosts or legends. It was something real, something dangerous and alive. The cabin stayed empty after I left. The local ranger told me others had reported strange noises, signs of something big in the woods, but no one stayed long enough to find out what. The truth was clear to me. The forest was watching, waiting, and it was better not to meet it face to face. From that trip onward, I learned to respect the silence, the shadows, and the wild places where humans are only visitors. The forest had spoken, in its own dark language, and I was lucky to leave with my life. It started with a decision that felt small at the time, but looking back, it was the beginning of everything that went wrong. I'd been looking for a break from the city, a weekend away to clear my head. I'd grown tired of the noise, the crowds, and the constant buzz of work emails. So I rented a cabin, a small, isolated place somewhere deep in the woods, far enough that I could forget about everything for a while. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was old but sturdy, weathered wood, a porch that creaked when you stepped on it, a rusty old wood stove inside, and a small fireplace with a chimney that smoked a little more than it should. The kind of place where you expected the floorboards to groan in the night, where the wind rattled the windows, and where the forest was so close you could almost reach out and touch it through the glass. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to sink behind the trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, with a faint trace of smoke from a nearby fire pit someone had used before me. The gravel driveway was narrow, flanked on either side by tall evergreens. The road that led here was long and winding, the kind you could imagine being lost on if you weren't careful. The key to the cabin was taped to the inside of the door frame, a little worn and scratched, but it worked perfectly. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt the chill that old cabins carry. The place was dusty, the furniture simple and sparse. A wooden table with a few mismatched chairs, a faded couch that looked like it had seen better days, and a small bookshelf with a handful of old paperbacks and survival manuals. I set down my bag and went to light a fire in the stove. The smell of burning wood soon filled the room, warming the chill out of the air. Outside, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening with every minute that passed. I sat down on the couch, pulled out a notebook, and began jotting down some thoughts. The silence was absolute except for the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That first night was mostly uneventful. I slept fitfully, the unfamiliar sounds of the forest making me jump awake more than once. There were rustling noises outside the window, branches scraping against the roof, and the distant howl of some animal I couldn't identify. I told myself it was just the wilderness and nothing more. The next morning, I woke early to the pale light filtering through the curtains. The air inside was cool, and the cabin still smelled faintly of smoke and pine. I brewed some coffee on the small gas stove and looked outside. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a dense wall of trees with no signs of human life. There was a narrow dirt path nearby, barely visible under fallen leaves, that looked like it might lead deeper into the woods. I decided to explore. I packed a small day pack with water, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and some snacks, then headed out. The forest was thick with underbrush, the ground soft and damp from recent rain. The path was narrow and twisted, and I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Birds darting between trees, squirrels scampering up trunks, and occasionally a flash of movement that disappeared before I could focus on it. The woods felt heavy, dense, and quiet in a way that made me aware of every single sound. My footsteps seemed loud in the stillness. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt, like the trees were closing in around me. I tried to keep track of where I was, but after a while, the path faded away entirely, leaving me surrounded by nothing but trees. I stopped, looked around, and realized I had no idea which way to go. The sun was high now, but the canopy above filtered the light so much that it was hard to tell directions. I pulled out my phone to check my location, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. That's when the unease started to grow. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of birds and animals vanished. The air grew still. I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anything. My skin prickled with a nervous energy, and I wanted nothing more than to turn around and head back. I turned, retraced my steps, but something felt off. The landmarks I thought I'd recognize were gone or looked unfamiliar. I kept walking, following the sun when I could, but the forest didn't relent. After what felt like hours, I found myself back near the cabin, just as the sun began to set. That evening, I made dinner over the stove and sat outside on the porch, watching the sky turn dark. The forest was quieter now, the sounds fading into an eerie stillness that made me feel exposed and small. The wind picked up, shaking the branches overhead, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. The nights that followed were worse. I started hearing things in the dark. Scratches on the walls, soft thumps outside, footsteps that weren't mine. Sometimes it felt like something was watching me from just beyond the tree line. But whenever I looked, there was nothing. The sounds never came all at once, but always just enough to keep me alert and uneasy. On the third night, I woke suddenly to a sharp noise at the door. Heart pounding, I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the entrance. The beam caught a shadow moving just beyond the porch, but when I shone it there, it vanished. The door was locked tight, but I could swear I heard breathing just outside. I sat on the floor, flashlight in hand, waiting for the noise to come back. It never did. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. The next day, I searched the perimeter of the cabin, looking for any signs of who or what might have been outside. There were footprints, large, heavy prints pressed into the dirt near the back porch. They were too big to be from any animal I knew, and they didn't match any human shoe prints I recognized. The prints circled the cabin but never got closer than a few feet. I felt trapped, like the cabin and the forest were closing in on me. The isolation was complete, and I realized I might not be alone in the woods after all. That afternoon, I tried to pack up and leave, but when I went to start the car, the battery was dead. There was no cell service, no one around for miles, and the forest had swallowed me whole. I spent the rest of the day trying to get the car working, but nothing helped. I had to accept that I was stuck until someone came out this way or until I could make it back on foot to a place with help. The following night was the worst. The noises outside grew louder, closer. Scratching at the windows, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. At one point, something slammed against the door hard enough to make the whole cabin shake. I huddled in a corner with my flashlight, trying to keep calm. Around dawn, the noises stopped. The forest returned to its normal quiet. I dared to step outside and found fresh footprints all around, deeper and more numerous than before. I spent the next day planning how to get out. The path I'd walked before was easy enough to find, but I knew the forest could be dangerous, and now I feared whatever was out there would follow me. That evening, I set up the stove and packed a small bag with essentials. I planned to leave at first light. When the sun rose, I stepped out onto the porch one last time and took a deep breath of cold morning air. The forest was quiet. The footprints were still there, but no sounds this time. I started walking the path back, moving quickly but carefully. The woods were thick, the sun filtering dimly through the branches. I kept glancing over my shoulder, waiting for something to appear, but nothing came. Hours later, I stumbled onto a logging road, the gravel crunching underfoot, and then finally, a faint hum of a distant highway. I kept walking, following the sounds until I reached a small town where I could get help. Looking back, I'm still not sure what those footprints were, or what made the noises at the cabin. No one believed me when I told the story. Some said it was a wild animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But the prints weren't right for any animal I'd seen in the area, and the way the noises circled the cabin, the way it felt like something was watching me, it was more than just an animal. I never went back to that cabin or the woods near it. I don't camp anymore. That experience left me with a lasting fear of the deep forest. Something about how quiet it can be when it's waiting. I I never thought I would look back on that weekend at the cabin as the scariest experience of my life. I don't mean scary like a movie or some wild story you tell around a campfire. I mean the kind of scary that settles deep into your bones and stays with you long after you leave. It's a real kind of fear, the kind that comes from being alone, helpless, and not sure what's lurking in the dark around you. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A friend of mine owned a small cabin way up in the mountains, in a remote part of the forest where cell service didn't reach and no one came by for days. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a modest wooden structure with a small porch, a fireplace, and a few basic furnishings. The whole place was surrounded by thick pine trees, with a narrow dirt road leading to it that twisted and climbed for miles from the nearest town. I wanted to get away from everything, the city noise, the constant buzz of people, and the endless responsibilities. I packed my things, grabbed some food, water, and gear, and drove up late on a Friday afternoon. The sky was clear, and the air smelled crisp and piney. It was perfect for a weekend of solitude, hiking, and quiet. The drive up was rough. The dirt road was full of ruts and rocks, and the car's suspension groaned every time I hit a bump. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, and the woods cast long, dark shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. I parked, stepped out, and took a deep breath. The silence was almost deafening. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it from the photos. Weathered wood, a few small windows, and a chimney that puffed out a thin stream of smoke. I fumbled with the keys, opened the door, and stepped inside. The place smelled like old wood and faintly of smoke. There were a couple of chairs, a small table, and a simple stove. A pile of firewood was stacked neatly by the door. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the stove to warm the place up. The sun dipped below the trees, and darkness crept in. I sat by the fire with a book, feeling relaxed and disconnected from everything. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, and the occasional snap of a twig broke the silence. I told myself it was just the forest settling for the night. That first night passed quietly. I woke up to the sound of birds and the faint light filtering through the window. I made coffee, ate some granola, and decided to explore the area. There was a small trail that led down the hill from the cabin, winding through the dense trees and disappearing into the underbrush. The trail was narrow and uneven, but I followed it anyway. The woods were beautiful. Tall pines, moss-covered rocks, and patches of wildflowers. I walked for about an hour, enjoying the fresh air and the solitude. No one else was around. No cars, no voices, just me and the forest. As I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, not mine, and definitely not animal tracks. They were human footprints, fresh and deep, heading away from the cabin down the trail. They looked like someone had passed by recently. I stopped and looked around, but the forest was empty. The footprints continued down the trail and vanished around a bend. I felt a slight chill, but told myself maybe someone else had been hiking earlier. It was a public forest, after all. I returned to the cabin and spent the afternoon reading and cleaning up. As the sun started to set again, I prepared a simple dinner on the stove, canned beans and bread. The fire in the stove crackled, and the room warmed up nicely. Around dusk, I stepped outside to stretch and get some air. The sky was turning deep orange and purple. The trees swayed softly in the breeze. That's when I noticed something else. A set of tire tracks in the dirt road leading up to the cabin. They were fresh. The impressions in the soft earth looked like someone had driven a truck or a large vehicle just a few hours before. I hadn't seen any cars coming or going since I arrived. I felt a little uneasy. Who else was out here? Why hadn't I seen anyone? The woods were supposed to be quiet and empty. I looked down the road in both directions. Nothing but trees and shadows. No lights, no sounds of an engine. I chalked it up to someone who had passed by earlier in the day, maybe another camper or a hunter. Still, the thought stuck with me. Night fell again, and the forest grew darker and quieter. The wind whispered through the trees, and the fire in the stove popped and hissed. I decided to go to bed early, feeling tired from the day's hike. I locked the doors and windows carefully and settled into the single bed in the corner. The cabin was cold without the fire, but I had a thick blanket. I tried to relax, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I kept hearing noises outside, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a branch, distant animal calls, but some of it didn't sound natural. Around midnight, I woke up. The room was pitch black except for the pale moonlight coming through the window. I heard something. Faint footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving near the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed still, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then, a low, muffled noise, like something scraping or shifting near the porch. I didn't dare look outside. I lay there frozen, waiting for the sounds to pass. After a few minutes, everything went silent again. The next morning, I found more signs that someone had been near the cabin. The firewood pile was disturbed, with logs scattered around like someone had rifled through it. A few footprints circled the porch, some deep and muddy. I hadn't left any fresh prints there. I spent the day on edge, checking the doors and windows constantly. I considered leaving, but the road was still rough and I wanted to avoid driving in the dark. As the day went on, the feeling that I was being watched only grew stronger. On the second night, the noises returned, louder this time. Around 2 a.m., I heard the crunching of footsteps on gravel outside the cabin. They moved slowly, circling the building. Then, the sound of a heavy object dragging across the dirt. I could almost feel the presence outside, just beyond the windows. I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove with a small flashlight, watching the windows and gripping a hatchet I found in the shed. Hours passed. Eventually, the noises stopped. Morning light felt like a blessing. During the day, I searched the area for clues. I found old makeshift traps in the woods, broken bottles, and scraps of torn clothing. Someone had been living or hiding nearby, but I couldn't find any signs of a camp or shelter. I called the local ranger station on a borrowed phone at the nearest town the next day, telling them about the signs of someone else being in the area, the strange tracks, and the disturbances around the cabin. They said they would send a ranger to check on things, but it might take a day or two. That night, I took extra precautions. I barricaded the doors with furniture, stacked more firewood by the windows, and kept the stove fire burning all night. But then, around midnight, something changed. The noises outside stopped. No footsteps, no dragging sounds, no rustling. Instead, I heard quiet tapping on the windows, slow, rhythmic, like someone lightly knocking. I didn't dare look. It lasted for a few minutes and then stopped. After that, the forest was silent again. I waited until morning, then packed up my things quickly. I didn't want to stay another night. I locked the cabin, loaded my gear, and started the bumpy drive back down the dirt road. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the trees. When I finally reached the paved road, cell service returned, and I called the ranger station again. They confirmed a ranger was on the way up to check the cabin. Weeks later, I learned from the local police that a man had been living in the woods near that area for years, a drifter who avoided contact with anyone. They found abandoned campsites with stolen supplies, evidence of break-ins, and signs that he had been watching people for a long time. The tapping on the windows, the footsteps, the disturbances around the cabin. It was all him. I never went back there. The silence of the forest was broken for me now. What I thought would be a peaceful escape became a reminder of how alone you can really be, and how real fear is when you're just one person, out in the woods with no one else around. I had been looking forward to a weekend alone in the woods for months. After a brutal stretch of work, dealing with endless calls, emails, and meetings, I needed a break. Just me, nature, and silence. No distractions, no people, no noise except the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. The cabin I rented was deep in the mountains, miles from any town or road. The kind of place where cell phones didn't work and the only real company was whatever wildlife happened to be nearby. It was late September when I left. The air was crisp, the kind that feels fresh but carries a slight chill that hints at winter's approach. I packed my gear carefully, enough food and water for 3 days, warm clothes, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a few books. No internet, no radio, just the essentials. I wanted to disconnect completely. The drive was long but quiet. I passed small towns, endless stretches of forest, and finally a narrow dirt road that twisted upward into the hills. The GPS stopped working after a certain point, but I had printed maps, and I knew the route well enough from the rental instructions. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as I pulled into the gravel driveway in front of the cabin. It was exactly as described, rustic, wooden, with a small porch and a woodpile stacked neatly by the side. The windows were dark, reflecting the fading light. I parked the car and unloaded my gear, feeling that familiar mix of excitement and relief that comes with escaping city life. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and faintly of pine. The furniture was simple: a table, chairs, a small stove, a bed, and shelves filled with books and board games. There was a stack of firewood by the fireplace. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension I had carried for weeks start to melt away. After unpacking, I made a small fire and sat close to it, warming my hands and sipping lukewarm coffee from my thermos. Outside, the darkness settled quickly. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches whispering in the wind. The moon wasn't quite full yet, but it cast a pale glow through the gaps in the branches. I had never been one to get scared easily. I've camped many times, hiked solo in the wilderness, and stayed in cabins before. Still, there was something about this place that felt different. Not because of ghosts or monsters, I don't believe in those things, but because the silence was so complete, so absolute, it pressed in on me like a physical thing. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. The mattress creaked under me, and I could hear the faint crackle of the dying fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and bending the trees. At some point during the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the cold or a noise outside. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight through the curtains. I lay still, listening. There was a sound. Not the wind, not an animal I recognized. Something more deliberate, a scraping or dragging noise just outside the cabin. I froze. The noise stopped. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably a branch or some animal knocking over debris, but the unease settled deep inside me. I lay awake for hours, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back to sleep. The next morning, the sky was gray, thick with clouds. I brewed coffee on the stove and sat by the window, looking out into the dense forest. The trees seemed normal enough, but the underbrush was disturbed. There were broken twigs and flattened patches of grass near the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my boots and a jacket, deciding to take a walk around the perimeter of the cabin. I wanted to see what might have caused the noise. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird or squirrel. The ground was soft with fallen leaves. As I walked, I noticed more signs that something had been close by. Footprints in the mud, too large for a deer, deeper and more uneven than a dog's. They led in a rough circle around the cabin, sometimes close to the windows, sometimes farther out among the trees. I followed the tracks carefully, keeping my eyes open for any sign of other people or animals. After about an hour, I found something that chilled me. A patch of earth where the dirt was freshly turned, and scattered pieces of trash, including some torn paper and an old beer can, lay half buried. It looked like someone had been digging or burying something just a few days ago. I scanned the trees, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The woods here were thick enough to hide someone easily. I thought about calling the rental company or the local ranger station, but my phone had no signal. I had brought a satellite messenger just in case, but I hadn't set it up yet. I returned to the cabin, feeling more on edge than before. That night, I took extra precautions. I barricaded the door with a heavy chair, stacked wood against the windowsills, and made sure the fire was roaring bright. I kept a knife close at hand, something I didn't usually do. The wind howled outside. I heard noises again, branches snapping, something moving in the brush. I stayed awake for a long time, eyes darting to every shadow. In the early hours, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I held my breath, clutching the knife. The footsteps paused, then moved away. Morning came finally. I forced myself to eat and packed a small bag with essentials. I decided to leave. This place wasn't safe. I grabbed the keys and went to the door. The chair blocking it was pushed aside. The firewood I stacked was scattered. Someone had been inside while I slept. Panic surged, but I kept calm. I checked the cabin quickly. Nothing missing except some food and my lighter. No sign of anyone else. I ran to the car, started the engine, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared. Back in town, I reported everything to the police. They took my statement but said it was a remote area with little patrol. They suggested it might be drifters or people looking for a place to drink or party. I knew it was worse than that. The experience stayed with me for months. I never went back. The cabin rental was taken off the market. They never found out who or what had been there. I still remember the silence, the cold watching eyes in the dark, the feeling of being hunted in a place that was supposed to be safe and quiet. The woods don't just hold animals and trees. Sometimes they hold people you don't want to meet. And sometimes, no matter how far you run, the fear stays with you.